afternoon, everyone. Like Amanda mentioned, my name is Haiat Iman, and I'm the Research and Evaluation Lead at Laidlaw Foundation. And I'm really happy to be here with all of you today. 10 years. Did you believe it's been 10 years since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released its final report? Well, this past year at Laidlaw, we decided to pause and reflect on our own journey and evaluate our commitments, asking ourselves questions such as, what have we learned? How have we shown up? And where do we still need to grow? So to answer these questions, we look back at Laidlaw Foundation's origin story, because to know where you're going, you need to know where you came from. And for similar reasons, we reviewed more than a decade of progress, grants, and policy, tracing how our priorities and practices have changed over time. We sat down with current and former staff, Indigenous advisors, board members, and youth leaders to hear directly how our work has touched our lives and where we've fallen short. And finally, we examined how our philanthropic practices align or do not align with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action and the Philanthropic Community's Declaration of Action. This wasn't an exercise of just gathering data. It was about listening deeply, celebrating progress, and being honest about the work that we're doing. So all of those conversations, and insights came together in a report that I invite you to pick up if you haven't already. And it tells the story in more detail than I can keep speaking. But for today, I would love to share 3 highlights with you. Before I mention those highlights, I will mention that the report, there was a slight mishap or a misprint. So we added an insert just to include the part that was supposed to be in there, but the official corrected version will be available digitally. And if you want a hard copy, then we have to send you a copy, just let us know. But with that said, the 3 things that I'd like to share with you today are the research process. So I'd like to provide you with a glimpse into how we looked back and listened. I'd like to share the key learnings, so the highlights, the lessons we've learned, and that we've taken to heart. And then finally, our vision for the future. So the research process. To understand our journey over the past decade, we undertook a research and reflection process that was both rigorous and relational. We began by revisiting Laidlaw's origin story, which is captured in Making Change 50 Years of the Laidlaw Foundation, which was edited by the late Nathan Gilbert, our former executive director of 30 years. The book traces the Laidlaw family's arrival in Canada in 1819, the creation of the Laidlaw Lumber Company in 1871, which prospered within colonial structures, and the foundation's establishment in 1949, ultimately leading to an Indigenous engagement strategy and the Indigenous Youth and Community Futures Fund, IYCFF, after the release of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. So this history reminded us that our resources were built through systems that created both opportunity and responsibility. Next, we reviewed more than a decade of programs and grants, from early Indigenous youth scholarships to today's Indigenous-led multi-year funding. We traced growth from 10 grants in IYCFF's first year to about 24 annually by 2022, with the fund expanding from roughly $400,000 in 2017 to $1 million today in 2021. We then examined grantee reports that described increased cultural engagement, confidence, and community connection, and we heard consistent requests for reduced administrative burdens, oral storytelling options, and multi-year support. To deepen our understanding, we drew on several key reports. First was Philanthropy in the Age of Reconciliation by the Circle of Philanthropy and Aboriginal Peoples in Canada, which guided our shift from commitment to meaningful action and emphasized reciprocity over charity. The second is Decolonizing the Indigenous Programs Evaluation and Reporting Practices by Johnston Research, a consultant that helped us rethink how impact is measured, centering Indigenous knowledge and community-defined success. And lastly, Indigenous Lenses, Decolonizing Brand Practice by my colleague Amanda Bernard, who's here with us today, and which informed us on how we adapt brand making to reduce barriers and elevate youth leadership. But data and reports alone cannot capture the full picture. We spoke directly with current and former staff, Indigenous advisors, and board members of youth leaders, inviting reflections, frustrations, and hopes. These conversations highlighted the real impact of funding decisions, the importance of cultural leadership, and the gaps that remain in supporting Indigenous self-determination. Finally, we examined how Laidlaw's philanthropic practices align or do not align with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action and the Philanthropic Community's Declaration of Action. This reflection revealed both areas of progress, such as supporting Indigenous-led resilience funds, and places where deeper transformation is still required, such as more access to barrier-free funding and multi-year funding as well. Ultimately, this process wasn't about auditing ourselves or checking boxes. It was about listening deeply, learning with humility, and grounding our next steps in the voices of those we aim to support, allowing Indigenous communities and youth leaders to guide not only our hindsight, but also our future, and offer a model for other allies on the journey of reconciliation. So what we've learned. Laidlaw's work with Indigenous communities has been a gradual journey of learning, missteps, and transformation. In the early years, our support was limited and sometimes fragmented. For example, in the 1990s, we funded scholarships for Indigenous youth and one-off cultural projects. While meaningful, these efforts were often short-term and did not address systemic inequities or structural barriers Indigenous youth were facing. The turning point came after the release of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report in 2015. The calls to action made clear that philanthropy had a role to play in reconciliation, but only if it was willing to move beyond charity and towards justice. At Laidlaw, this required more than new funding streams. It demanded a cultural and organizational shift. This journey, however, has not been perfect. Across our operations, investments, and granting practices, we've had to confront our blind spots, acknowledge power imbalances, and shift decision-making, not just to make space for Indigenous leadership, but also to ensure that our work does not continue to cause harm to Indigenous people. Step by step, Laidlaw has moved from simply supporting Indigenous work to walking alongside communities in long-term partnership. Through this method of reflection, several lessons have stood out that should our work today. The first one is that relationships are the foundation. We've learned that reconciliation cannot be advanced through transactional funding. It requires trust, humility, and ongoing dialogue. Many grantees told us that what they valued most wasn't just the dollars, but the sense of being heard, respected, and supported without heavy bureaucracy. The second one, Indigenous youth are leaders now, not leaders in waiting. Young people are carrying forward cultural knowledge, building community programs, and creating new models of leadership. Our role is to back their vision, not impose our own. Third, flexibility matters. We heard consistently that flexible multi-year funding allows communities to take risks, respond to evolving needs, and invest in long-term change. Rigid structures undermine creativity and self-determination. Fourth, philanthropy must address its own history. As we reflect on our origin story, we recognize that our resources were built on colonial systems. That recognition isn't about guilt, it's about responsibility. We have a duty to redistribute wealth and decision-making power in ways that support justice. Lastly, evaluation must be decolonized. As the report from Johnson Research mentioned and others pushed us to reimagine what success could look like, impact isn't about just numbers on a spreadsheet. It's about the stories, the relationships, the preservation of languages, and more youth who feel more connected to their culture and their identity. Taken together, these lessons remind us that reconciliation is not a project with an end. It is an ongoing practice of accountability, repair, and solidarity. So our vision. As we reflect on the past 10 years, the questions we keep returning to is, what does the next decade of reconciliation and relationship building look like for Laidlaw? Our vision is grounded in 3 commitments. The first one is deepening our support for Indigenous youth leadership. We know Indigenous youth are not just future leaders, they are leaders now. We've expanded our Indigenous Youth and Community Futures Fund to 1 million annually, and will continue to ensure it remains flexible, accessible, and led by Indigenous voices. Second, shifting power and practice in philanthropy. Philanthropy must confront its history and structures. At Laidlaw, that means rethinking who makes decisions, how accountability is defined, and how resources are shared. We aim to model trust-based decolonizing philanthropy. And lastly, walking alongside communities, not ahead of them. True reconciliation is not about rushing towards an outcome, but about building long-term relationships. Our role is to listen, to learn, and to walk in step with Indigenous communities. We will continue to ask, what do you need? How can we show up better? And then act on those answers with humility. This vision is about giving Indigenous youth and communities not just a seat at the table, but the ability to shape it. And as we move forward, we invite others in philanthropy to join us with courage, accountability, and willingness to change. Reconciliation at its heart is a collective journey. That is it.